Greetings YouTube, Skill Incarnate with the 10th episode of my Project Zomboid tutorial series. Today's episode is going to focus on the subject of pottery. Now pottery is something which is completely added by the Hydrocraft mod and is one of the most useful aspects of the mod. I initially thought that pottery had no practical use, but I was very wrong. Pottery allows you to create several very useful tools and items. The most useful being the ability to make molds, and molds will allow you to create ingots from metal. And for those of you who have played other survival games like 7 Days to Die, you know how useful metal ingots can be, because you can use those as a building material to make many useful tools and weapons. And the same thing is true in Project Zomboid. Now, to create any sort of pottery, you're going to need a few things, which I've actually got here. The first thing you're going to need is the pottery textbook. Now the pottery textbook can be found amongst any other books at a bookstore or inside any house on a bookshelf. If you want some more information on how to find books in general, have a look at my Finding Books and Medicine tutorial. Now we've got the pottery textbook here. I've actually read it, and it unlocks the ability to make a kiln. Now the kiln is basically the structure which allows you to smelt down the clay, which you will see here. We've got grey and red clay, and to make that into various pottery items. Some examples of that include the clay pots, which can be used to grow hydrocraft crops like hemp and rice. There are, of course, your ingot molds, which will allow you to smelt down items like metal into ingots, which can be then used to build things like boxes of nails or weapons. And finally, you can use them for making items to store liquids such as water. And a good example of that is the clay mug and the clay teapot. Now, of those of you who know how important water is in Project Zomboid, and depending on your position in the game, you may find yourself short on items to store water. This can be a lifesaver. Now, once you've read the book, you will get the ability to make a kiln. And to make a kiln, you will need 50 units of clay. Now, where do you find clay in the game? Well, there's two ways to find clay. You can find bags of clay like this in any warehouse or in hobby stores. Hobby stores are those stores where you'll find toys. So electronic stores, hobby stores, you'll know when you go in because you'll see all the shelves are covered in toys. That is where I found this bag of grey clay and this bag of red clay. Now you can also find clay in the wild in just lumps such as this. And you will find this by foraging in any wooded area, such as a forest, any area that's outside of town with trees. If you right click on the ground and you have the option to forage, then you will be able to forage for clay. And there is a percentage chance that you will find clay. This is probably the best way to find clay because bags of clay can be pretty hard to come by. Though it did take me quite a bit of searching to find enough clay to build this kiln. Now, to build a kiln, you will need 50 units of clay. Now, you can get 50 units of red clay or 50 units of grey clay. In my case, I have the grey clay. Now, there is no difference between the two types of clay. It's just purely an aesthetic choice. Now, before you use the kiln, a couple of words of warning. The kiln does carry with it a chance of hurting you. You can be burned by the kiln and you can start a fire. So my recommendation is to always create the kiln as far away from your base as humanly possible, and always try and have a source of water nearby in case a fire starts. Now we're going to unpack these 3 bags of clay here. We now have 60 units of clay in our inventory. If I right click on that, I have the ability to make a kiln. As you can see, the requirement is 50 clay. We now have a kiln in our inventory, and this is basically the building which is used for all of our pottery. I'm going to place it on the ground, and here we have our kiln. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the items that I'll need to use the kiln. The first thing you'll need is either a lighter or a notched wooden plank. Either of these can be used to fire off the kiln. The other thing I suggest, as before, make sure you have a bucket of water with you. And finally, make sure you've got some sterilized bandages and also a bit of pain relief, such as this whiskey. In case you are burned, you may need to apply a bandage in order to fix the burn. Now again, the chance of being burned is rather small, but if you do receive a burn, you want to try and bandage it as soon as possible. Now the first thing we're going to need to use with this kiln is to make some charcoal. Now charcoal has many different ways of being constructed, but one of my users, Delilah from Down Under, shout out to you, has instructed me that you can actually use a dead body of a zombie to burn in the kiln and you can make charcoal. So I've actually grabbed these volunteers who are laying on the ground here, and we're going to grab one and we are going to roast them and create a bag of charcoal. Now to create a bag of charcoal you will need an ignition source in your inventory. In our case it's our hapless victim here. And you will also need a accelerant, something to light the kiln. In our case we have our wooden plank. We're going to right click here and we're going to select the make charcoal option. Now as you can see, we can use a number of different options to make charcoal. You can also, if you don't have access to corpses, which if you're not a if you're not a half decent Project Zomboid player, you may have that problem if you have been avoiding combat, but you can also find clothes and tear them into ripped clothing. And this will give you some ripped sheets. And you'll need 50 of these, and 50 ripped sheets can be used to create some charcoal. But we are going to use our corpse because I have an absolute ocean of them at the moment. As you can see, that's made us a lump of charcoal. Now, one thing to note is that every time you use the kiln, it will actually expend some of your ignition source, so your lighter. And if you use a wooden plank to actually use the kiln, it will consume one wooden plank per use of the kiln. This is not like the fire where the notched wooden plank is reusable. You will need to make a heap of these. So what we can do, if we want to save a little bit of our fuel source, we can put the lighter away and we can use our wooden plank as an accelerant. So the next thing we will need to use with the kiln is, of course, we'll need some clay in our inventory. And we will need our accelerant, which is in our case our notched wooden plank. We can right click on our kiln and then we will have the option to make some of our items. I'm now going to go through the list of items that you can make in the kiln. I used the information from the Hydrocraft wiki, which is my source of truth, and I'm going to put that in the description. I can't go over every single thing that you can make in the kiln because there are hundreds of different items, but we're going to give you a little bit of a rundown. I'm now going to go over each of the items that you can make in the kiln, and going from the top of the list, we have the clay pot. This costs 5 units of clay, and it doesn't have a current use according to the Hydrocraft wiki, nor have I found any current use for the clay pot, so I give this one a miss. The clay flower pot is very useful. It allows you to build each of the Hydrocraft specific crops like rice and hemp, provided you can find the matching seeds. Now this will be the subject of a future advanced farming tutorial, so stay tuned. Very useful. It only costs 6 units of clay. The clay jar has a cost of 6 units of clay, and the small clay jar has a cost of 3 units of clay. These are currently used in the herbalist table, and they also have the function of being able to make rennet. Now, rennet, for those who don't know, is an ingredient in making cheese, and if you have access to a cow or a goat, this can be very useful. Now, I'll be covering animal husbandry in a future episode, so these can be quite useful. When we cover that, I'll show you how to make cheese. The clay mug has a cost of 2 units of clay and operates in the exact same way as a normal mug. I primarily use it to store water and to make cups of tea and coffee. The clay teapot is exactly the same as a normal teapot. It has a cost of 4 units of clay and is primarily used by me to store water. Now, in situations where I cannot find a cooking pot or a clay teapot, or where we have the zombie spawn rate on insane and you are having trouble finding something, this can be a lifesaver. The clay urn has a cost of 10 units of clay, and it currently doesn't have a use according to the wiki. Again, this will change in a future release of Hydrocraft. The clay pipe has a cost of 2 units of clay and can be used to smoke tobacco or marijuana. They have various benefits, including a pain relief and stress relief, and I intend to test these out in a future episode of my tutorial, not in real life. The ingot molds, these are very, very useful, and these make up the last things that you can create in the kiln. Each of these have a cost of 1 unit of clay, and the list goes as such. The iron ingot mold, which is used in the creation of iron ingots, which can be used to make tools and weapons. This is one of the most used molds, and I primarily use it to make myself weapons like swords and tools like axes. The ring mold doesn't have a current use in the game apart from making rings. Now, I thought this was actual metal rings for machinery, but according to the Hydrocraft wiki, it is only wearable rings, like wedding rings. And if you've killed a few dozen zombies, you're going to find these in the world anyway. So I don't use this very often. The nail mold, self-explanatory. If you can find some metal in the world and melt it down, or if you're lucky enough to have a mine, you can actually smelt the metal into a box of nails. Extremely useful if you are not using a mod like the mod that I'm using, which is the wooden dowels mod, allowing you to build using wooden dowels rather than nails. Now, the screw mold is another very useful mold, and if you are not living in a hardware store like the one where I am, you are going to need this because screws have a number of applications. The main one I use them for, if I have some, are making weapons like a baseball bat with screws, because you can save your nails for building purposes. The other use of screws is to build the industrial furnace, which you'll be using for advanced blacksmithing, and I'll be covering this in a future episode of my tutorials. The gear mold is used in making gears of various different types. You can make metal gears, aluminum gears, and so forth. Now, according to the wiki, at this stage, these don't actually have a use. So I actually haven't found any use for these. That, again, will change in a future episode. The bung mold is used for making rubber bungs, and these are used to create your test tubes and your beakers. These are very useful if you have a chemistry lab, and you can use these to make things like your painkillers and antibiotics. Very useful if you have a chemistry lab, but is a very, very late game application, and admittedly I haven't gotten my hands into chemistry much. We'll be covering this in a future episode of the tutorial series. The anvil mold is required for you to make an anvil, of course, and the anvil's main use, much like many other survival games, is the creation of metal weapons and tools. You'll need this to make anything out of metal, such as an axe or a sword or axe. Very useful, but you will need a lot of metal to make one of these. The giant magnet mold is used in the creation of a junkyard. Now, the primary use of a junkyard is to allow you to go through rubbish you find in the world and extract useful items such as old microwaves, old metal items, pull them apart, and if you're lucky, you'll be able to get some electronic parts out of them. The main thing I use the junkyard for is getting old metal items and melting them down to make things like nails, using these nail molds and metal weapons out of iron ingots. The bullet casing mold is self-explanatory. You can melt down brass if you can find it in the mine and make yourself some casings to construct bullets. The bullet tips are also used in the construction of bullets along with gunpowder. The buckshot is, for those who don't know, buckshot is a item used in the construction of shotgun shells. Very useful since the shotgun is quite effective in this game. And finally we have the block mold, and this is used in making concrete blocks or red bricks. This currently doesn't have an application according to the wiki, nor have I found an application for it. Now, out of all of these items that you can make, there are hundreds of different items that you can construct using these molds, as I've mentioned before. But out of all of these, the most useful ones are the flower pot for your hydrocraft farming needs, the ingot mold for making tools and weapons out of iron. You will of course need to make yourself an anvil using the anvil mold before you can make any of those. Your nail mold for making nails if you're not using a mod such as the wooden dowels mod. And finally, of course, your bullet molds. Once you get to late game, if you combine these with the ORMtnMans Guns mod, you will be a walking arsenal. So that's it for the tutorial on the kiln and on pottery. Again, I don't have enough clay to go through and show you the construction of each of these items. But it's very self-explanatory. Once you get these items, we will be going over their application in future episodes. But I just wanted to show you how to construct the kiln and all of the items that you can make along with their costs and their common applications. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and this tutorial series so far. I hope you found this useful. Again, I'm only touching on the basic application of the kiln and of pottery. And we will be going over some of the items that you can make, and we will be doing a separate episode on smelting, because smelting is a natural follow-on from pottery. You can smelt down a lot of the items that you can find in the mine, and you can make some very advanced items depending on what you find in the world. But we'll be covering that in a future episode when I get the required materials to build myself a smelter and a furnace. So that's it for now. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a subscribe, leave me a like. In the world of YouTube completely destroying people's revenue and channels, a couple of likes and a couple of subscribes never hurts. So yeah, it helps me to understand what you guys are enjoying and whether you're getting any value out of these series. So that's it for me. Hope you enjoyed this as always, and we'll see you for the next episode. Until next time, Skill Incarnate out.